Early American history is often told through the stories of a few well-known names. But many brave and important people have been forgotten over time. These heroes played key roles in shaping the country, but their stories are not always taught or remembered. Some fought in wars, others helped build communities, and some stood up for justice when it was dangerous to do so. Their actions made a real difference, even if they did not become famous. Learning about them helps us understand history in a deeper and more human way. Here are 10 forgotten heroes from early American history whose courage and effort deserve more attention today. In March of 1770, within the cold, snow-packed streets of colonial Boston, the simmering tensions between frustrated townspeople and occupying British soldiers reached a violent, historical breaking point. At the front of the protesting crowd stood Crispus Attucks, a courageous sailor and dock worker of African and native American descent who had escaped a life of enslavement 2 decades prior to build a free life upon the Atlantic docks. As the angry confrontation intensified outside the custom house, British troops opened fire directly into the unarmed civilian crowd. Attucks was hit instantly by 2 musket balls, collapsing onto the icy cobblestones as the very first casualty of what would become the Boston Massacre. His tragic death sent shockwaves through the 13 colonies, transforming him into a powerful rallying cry for the patriot cause and a profound symbol of the high price of American liberty. Long before the first formal battles of the war were fought at Lexington and Concord, Crispus Attucks made the ultimate sacrifice, forever securing his monumental place in history as the first person to die for the birth of a new nation. In April of 1777, as the flames of the American Revolution consumed the colonies, a daring act of heroism unfolded across the rain-swept countryside of New York and Connecticut, when British troops launched a destructive raid on the vital Continental Supply Depot at Danbury. A messenger rode out to sound the alarm, arriving exhausted at the home of Colonel Henry Ludington, with his militiamen scattered across the region and no soldiers to spare. His 16-year-old daughter, Sibyl Ludington, volunteered to take his place. Stepping into the dark, stormy night, she mounted her horse, Star, and embarked on a perilous 40-mile journey through unfamiliar woods plagued by bandits and loyalist patrols, riding completely alone through the pitch blackness. Sibyl repeatedly used a wooden stick to bang on dark cabin doors, shouting into the night to wake the sleeping countryside. By the break of dawn, her iron resolve successfully gathered over 400 militiamen, allowing them to march out and confront the retreating British forces. Through her extraordinary courage and immense endurance, Sibyl Ludington rode twice the distance of Paul Revere, forever securing her legacy as a brilliant symbol of young patriotism and an indomitable hero of the American fight for independence. In June of 1775, upon the smoke-choked, blood-stained slope of Breed's Hill, the raw courage of early American patriots clashed directly with the disciplined might of the British Empire. Standing firm within the embattled colonial redoubt was Peter Salem, an African-American soldier who had recently gained his freedom from enslavement to enlist as a Massachusetts Minuteman. Having already stood his ground at the opening battles of Lexington and Concord, Salem faced his ultimate test during the fierce, legendary crucible of the Battle of Bunker Hill. As the professional British forces launched a devastating third assault up the hill, a prominent enemy officer, Major John Pitcairn, breached the earthen wall and confidently declared victory over the defending forces. In a pivotal moment of extreme pressure, Salem stepped forward, aimed his musket, and fired the fatal shot that mortally wounded the British commander, instantly stalling the enemy vanguard and providing an invaluable boost to colonial morale. Throughout nearly 5 grueling years of subsequent service in the Continental Army, including key campaigns at Trenton and Saratoga, he remained a steadfast defender of the revolutionary cause. Peter Salem shattered the prejudices of his era, securing his enduring legacy as a premier hero of the American Revolution. In May of 1782, as the American Revolution neared its final chapters, an extraordinary act of individual defiance challenged the deeply entrenched gender boundaries of the colonial era. Desperate to serve her young nation, but barred by law from military enlistment, a 21-year-old woman named Deborah Sampson took the ultimate personal risk. Binding her chest and adopting the male alias of Robert Shirtliff, she successfully enlisted as a private in the elite light infantry company of the 4th Massachusetts Regiment. Known for their physical agility and rapid deployment, Sampson's unit was sent into the dangerous, chaotic skirmishes of the lower Hudson Valley, where she proved herself an exceptionally astute and resilient soldier. When a fierce firefight against British loyalists left her with a deep saber gash to her head and a musket ball embedded in her thigh, her fierce dedication to her secret drove her to a desperate measure. Fearing immediate medical detection, she utilized a simple penknife to agonizingly extract the bullet from her own flesh, stitching the wound herself before returning directly to the front lines. Her true identity remained entirely undetected for nearly a year and a half, until a malignant fever left her unconscious in a Philadelphia hospital, leading to her discovery and subsequent honorable discharge. By order of General George Washington, by stepping out of the domestic sphere to answer the call of liberty, Deborah Sampson shattered the military conventions of her time, earning an esteemed legacy as one of the very first women to fight for the United States and a towering icon of patriotic grit. In the crucial summer of 1781, as the American Revolution moved toward its grand strategic climax in Virginia, a brilliant covert operation unfolded that would alter the course of global history. At the center of this espionage network was James Armistead, an enslaved African-American who received permission from his master to enlist under the French commander, the Marquis de Lafayette. Posing as a runaway slave, looking to guide British troops through the complex Virginia terrain, Armistead successfully infiltrated the camp of the notorious turncoat Benedict Arnold, and later British commander Lord Charles Cornwallis. His exceptional intelligence and local knowledge quickly earned the absolute trust of the British High Command, who recruited him to spy on the Americans inadvertently, turning him into one of the war's most effective double agents. Armistead masterfully fed the British carefully fabricated misinformation while smuggling critical, highly accurate intelligence back to Lafayette, including detailed reports on British troop movements, supply lines, and fortification strengths. This invaluable intelligence allowed the Allied American and French forces to perfectly orchestrate the encirclement of Yorktown, cutting off Cornwallis's escape routes and forcing the historic British surrender that effectively won the war. Though initially denied his freedom after the victory, a personal letter of commendation from Lafayette directly to the Virginia general assembly secured his full emancipation in 1787, adopting the surname Lafayette in honor of his wartime commander. James Armistead, Lafayette secured an immortal legacy as a master spy whose daring intellect proved absolutely indispensable to the birth of American liberty. In the late 1770s, as the brutal Civil War of the American Revolution fractured the isolated backcountry of the Georgia frontier, a fiercely independent woman became one of the most feared and formidable defenders of the patriot cause. This was Nancy Hart, a 6-foot-tall, muscular frontierswoman whose legendary exploits against British loyalists, known as Tories, cemented her status as a master of irregular warfare. With her husband away serving in the Georgia militia, Hart single-handedly protected her homestead along the Broad River, utilizing her exceptional marksmanship and deep survival skills. Operating as a highly effective patriot spy, she regularly crossed enemy lines, disguised as a simple-minded man, to infiltrate British garrisons and gather critical, actionable intelligence for continental authorities. Her most famous act of defiance occurred when a band of loyalist soldiers invaded her home and demanded a meal. Hart calmly plied them with wine, systematically dismantled and hid their muskets through a gap in the cabin wall, and subsequently shot those who resisted, holding the rest at bay until help arrived. By turning her remote cabin into an unyielding fortress of liberty, Nancy Hart shattered every colonial convention of her era, securing her immortal legacy as Georgia's ultimate war woman and a towering icon of raw, revolutionary grit. In the dark and desperate winter of 1781, as the Continental Army stood on the absolute brink of total financial collapse, a brilliant financier, quietly orchestrated the economic survival of the American Revolution. This was Haym Salomon, a Polish-born Jewish immigrant, who arrived in New York City and quickly established himself as a master broker and merchant. Driven by a deep passion for liberty, Salomon joined the Sons of Liberty and used his vast language skills and financial network to spy on British forces, surviving arrest and a death sentence to escape to the revolutionary capital of Philadelphia. When General George Washington desperately needed thousands of dollars to march his army toward the critical Battle of Yorktown, he famously turned to his superintendent of finance with a single, urgent command: "Send for Haym Salomon." Salomon answered the call immediately, personally raising, brokering, and lending hundreds of thousands of dollars in interest-free loans to secure food, uniforms, and vital military supplies for the starving troops. He consistently negotiated favorable loans from European governments and personally paid the salaries of key American leaders out of his own pocket to keep the young government functioning. To secure food, uniforms, and vital military supplies for the starving troops, he consistently negotiated favorable loans from European governments and personally paid the salaries of key American leaders out of his own pocket to keep the young government functioning. In November of 1776, upon the rocky, heavily fortified heights of northern Manhattan, a desperate defensive stand against overwhelming British forces pushed one woman into the front lines of American military history. This was Margaret Corbin, a courageous camp follower who had marched alongside her husband, John, an artilleryman in the Pennsylvania militia, when a massive wave of British and Hessian troops launched a ferocious assault during the Battle of Fort Washington. Margaret stood directly by her husband's side at the artillery line, assisting him in loading and preparing their heavy cannon under intense enemy fire. In the midst of the chaotic bombardment, John was struck down and killed instantly, leaving the vital piece of artillery completely unmanned. Without a moment of hesitation, Margaret stepped over her fallen husband, took his place at the gun, and single-handedly cleaned, loaded, aimed, and fired the cannon with remarkable precision and speed. She kept the weapon operating relentlessly, holding back the advancing enemy vanguard until a devastating volley of British grapeshot tore through her body, inflicting severe wounds to her jaw, chest, and shoulder. Though the fort ultimately fell and she was captured, her extraordinary bravery did not pass unnoticed. By risking her life at the cannon's breech, Margaret Corbin became the very first woman in American history to receive a lifelong military pension from Congress, forever securing her immortal legacy as Captain Molly and one of the finest heroes of the War for Independence. In the winter of 1781, across the rugged backcountry of South Carolina, the future of the American Revolution rested on the tactical genius of a legendary frontier commander. This was Daniel Morgan, a fiercely resilient leader who rose from the ranks of a wagon driver to become one of General George Washington's most dependable military strategists. Celebrated for his elite corps of Virginia sharpshooters, Morgan was tasked with disrupting British supply lines in the South, while being relentlessly pursued by a superior, aggressive British cavalry force. At the pasture lands, known as the Cowpens, Morgan chose to stand and fight, orchestrating a masterclass in military tactics. Understanding the psychological tendencies of both his own raw militia and the overconfident enemy, he deployed a unique three-line defense that feigned a chaotic retreat, luring the British vanguard into a devastating double envelopment. In less than an hour, Morgan's brilliant strategy completely decimated the elite British force, capturing over 500 enemy soldiers and fundamentally turning the tide of the Southern campaign. By transforming a desperate retreat into a crushing victory, Daniel Morgan cemented his legacy as a tactical mastermind and one of the finest battlefield commanders in American military history. During the harsh winter of 1777, as the British Army occupied the revolutionary capital of Philadelphia, a quiet act of defiance by one unassuming citizen altered the course of the war. This was Lydia Darragh, a Quaker mother and dedicated patriot whose home on 2nd Street was commandeered by British officers for secret high-level meetings. On the evening of December 2nd, while pretending to be asleep, She listened through the keyhole of an upper room as British commanders finalized plans for a devastating surprise attack on General George Washington's Continental Army, then encamped just miles away at Whitemarsh. Recognizing the imminent danger to the American cause, Darragh orchestrated a daring covert mission. The following morning, she obtained a pass through British lines under the pretext of purchasing flour from a mill outside the city. Instead, she pushed past the checkpoint, riding through the cold, snowy until she encountered an American officer, Colonel Thomas Craig, to whom she delivered the warning. Because of her brave and timely intelligence, Washington's army was prepared and fortified, deterring the ambush and forcing a retreat. By turning eavesdropping into a strategic victory, Lydia, Darragh, cemented her legacy as a formidable patriot and one of the most effective civilian spies of the American Revolution.